Handing over to Fabrizio to welcome. I'm handing over to Fabrizio to introduce, and I'll close, and then we'll hand over to Bagele. Over, Fabrizio.
Okay, thank you very much, and good afternoon to everyone, to the Evaluation Advisory Panel members and to the colleagues who are following. And today we have the last of this round, at least, presentation by the member of Evaluation Advisory Panel. And today we have Professor Bagele Chilisa, who is presenting. And many of you know her, and she is a professor at University of Botswana. And she's been there for many years. And she is also well known internationally, also for collaboration with UN agencies. She has been also a former president of the Evaluation Society of Botswana. She has a doctorate in policy planning and evaluation from the University of Pittsburgh in the USA. And internationally, she's very well known for her studies and publication on decolonizing research, decolonizing evaluation, and indigenous evaluation, which is a topic of the presentation today. So without much further ado, we would like to hear from her. And we are very curious about the presentation that she's going to have today. So Bagele, the floor is to you.
Thank you, colleagues. Thank you, Ifat. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to discuss this topic, which is a topic in my heart. I always discuss it with a lot of passion, and I hope I do so today. So basically, I'll be looking at what indigenous evaluation is, why it is important, and what IFAD can do. And so I have said that indigenous evaluation, I look at it as evaluation that problematizes mainstream evaluation as a system of knowledge based on Western indigenous knowledge systems, culture, philosophies, and social science theory that cannot and should not be treated as the universal norm upon which all knowledge systems should bow. Indigenous science evaluation problematizes the insufficient integration of the cultural, social in evaluation theory and practice. And indigenous science evaluation has a decolonization intention. It intends to decolonize evaluation. And what do we mean by decolonizing evaluation? From where I'm sitting, to decolonize evaluation is to restructure power relations in the global construction of evaluation knowledge projection so that we can give space to those whose voices have been muted by the evaluation discipline colonial attitude. And decolonizing evaluation interchangeably. And so, indigenous evaluation also aims for integration of knowledge systems. It proposes integration of knowledge under a paradigm characterized by the common ontological, epistemological, axiological assumption from the perspective of the formerly colonized non-Western societies. This does not mean that it is a substitute for the four common paradigms, namely the post-positivist, the pragmatist, the interpretive, and the fourth paradigm, which is the social justice, the transformative paradigm, sorry. Yes, So the four paradigms, namely the post-positivist, the transformative, the pragmatic, and the interpretive. So those are the four paradigms that control how we see the world and how we see evaluation and how we can do evaluation. So the argument is that indigenous evaluation is about launching a fifth paradigm that sees evaluation from the perspective of those who have been colonized and their voices muted. So I'll talk about the myth about evaluation, about indigenous evaluation. Some think indigenous evaluation is carried out by indigenous people and it is cultural specific and lacks generalizability. I've heard some people saying, oh, it's indigenous evaluation. It doesn't evolve us because we are from the West. We use Eurocentric approaches. We are not going to be doing research in indigenous communities, and therefore we do not need to learn, to know, and to hear about indigenous evaluation. I'm here to say that it concerns all of us all, because it is about decolonizing the very Western Eurocentric evaluation approaches that are dominating the world. People may not be researching in indigenous communities, but they have to know that the very models and frameworks that are used in indigenous communities are oppressive. And if we talk of social justice, we can't talk of social justice without talking about social justice of knowledge systems. So when I speak of indigenous evaluation, I'm referring to indigenous science evaluation from the perspective of the formerly colonized non-Western societies. What is indigenous is the knowledge system, which I call indigenous science. And some people say, indigenous knowledge system is not science. My response is that it is science because it is gathered through methods that are empirical, experimental, and systematic. Some will say that there is a myth that Western science is rational, objective, and universal, while indigenous knowledge is not. And the response is that a cultural view of science sees science as historical, sociological, cultural, and political. And therefore, Euro-Western perspectives are perspectives from Western indigenous philosophies and cultures. So according to Kuhn, there are usually revolutions. Knowledge revolutions occur leading to new paradigms. And I'm saying that what we are witnessing is a knowledge revolution giving recognition to indigenous science paradigms. There is also a myth that IKS relates only to a particular people and their understanding of the world. I give an example of the San people who chewed the Hodia cactus plant to starve of hunger, and to say that a pharmaceutical company in the United Kingdom took some active ingredients from the cactus and manufactured it into a pill. This example.
My apologies. Sorry, Bagele. Are we seeing the right slide?
Oh, I stopped. Oh, sorry. I'm very sorry. Hey,
no, sorry to you.
We panic, eh? We panic. You don't. So I was not changing slides. So here it is. So here is where we are. IKS relates only to a particular people, and that no, it does not. IKS is complementary to Western science. And the example of the cactus plant shows how actually Western science was able to learn from indigenous science. And I also go on to say that the philosophy of Ubuntu, I am because we are, is the direct opposite of Rennie's philosophy of I am, therefore I am. The only difference is that with Western science, they attach the author. We do not attach the author, but I am because we are is a very, very powerful philosophy that we think should be included and inform how we do business in evaluation. And its omission from the discourse in evaluation is very serious and point to the marginalization of indigenous science evaluation. And it is not only Ubuntu, there are also other relational indigenous science philosophies that are valuable knowledge assets that can inform principles of social and ecological justice that can help to monitor, learn, and evaluate the SDGs, for example, on climate change. Yes, a revolution is around the corner. The evaluation discipline is under tremendous pressure. And the field is under terrible pressure because of its bias. The field, the evaluation field has a bias. This bias is towards use of blind reliance on Western evaluation models, framework, strategies, data gathering instrument, and using them in middle and income countries without necessarily contextualizing them. The discipline history is also not very favorable. The discipline of evaluation was born out of the need to account for project funds and to ensure compliance. In middle and income countries, there's more emphasis on accountability and compliance at the neglect of the benefits of the recipients. And it is in middle income countries that evaluation carries a colonial attitude where whatever is from the North is considered a superior. And the evaluation field has this language problem, deficit theorizing, labeling, deficit labeling of most of the things, almost everything that comes from low and middle income countries. And sometimes there is also a bias of hiding, concealing asymmetries in the field. For example, we talk of country-led evaluation. The whole thing of country-led evaluation is misleading because the evaluation process is carried out using Eurocentric evaluation frameworks. What is country-led here? What does it mean? It reminds me so much of the system of indirect rule. In Africa, the British ruled the colonies through a system of indirect rule. And that happened because the chiefs were resisting, the people were resisting British rule. And what did the British do? They just sent the laws to control the colonies to the chiefs and asked the chiefs to implement. That was the system of indirect rule. So it's so similar to evaluation today. The experts, so-called experts, they go and implement Eurocentric models of evaluation under the context of country-led evaluation. So there is a cultural view of science from the perspective of Kuhn that social science is historical, is sociological, is political, is cultural. And so the current Euro-Western paradigms today are treated as ahistorical, apolitical, and cultural neutral, which is not the case. And evaluators have warned, like Shadish has warned, that this omission of ontological and epistemological discussions of assumptions that drive evaluation has led to a stagnation in evaluation, where thinking beyond Euro-Western based philosophies has been totally stopped. And what is worse is that Western evaluators themselves are reluctant to engage with philosophies that come from non-Western societies. More so, philosophies that deal with connections between the living and the non-living. And this we have referred to as philosophies that deal with relational ontologies and relational epistemologies. They do not see how the connectedness of the living and the non-living and spirituality can be important aspects of context in evaluation. So my argument is that, and the argument of indigenous scholars is that there is need to consider spirituality as an important context that is important in looking at evaluation. When we talk about context, we are talking about the deep connection to spirituality practices and how they influence how learning and knowing occurs, and how they influence how people, recipients of projects, interact with the project, and how spirituality influences how people behave. And so when we talk of philosophies that emphasize interconnectedness, we are also talking about the interconnectedness of human beings with each other. And that is an important dimension of context. Context as relationality implies that individual interventions may be less effective than multiple projects that are designed at systems level, because connectedness implies complexity. And the habit of just identifying a need as if the needs are heterogeneous, that comes from Euro-Western science that usually look at individual categories instead of looking at the connections. Today, we talk of complexity, we talk of systems science thinking. Well, indigenous evaluation, indigenous knowledge has had all of that, because relationality and interconnectedness is what our complexity, is what indigenous complexity and systems thinking is all about. So where are we? The first view is that indigenous science and Western science are complementary. And therefore, there is a call for co-creation of evaluation research knowledge, co-creation by Westerners and non-Western societies. And now the problem is, where should this co-creation occur? Some people emphasize that it should occur in a neutral space. But others say that for as long as some knowledges are already more important than others, that space is not going to be sympathetic and fair to indigenous knowledge systems. And so some have said that we can have national evaluation frameworks, and that there's no need for us to think of evaluation frameworks or philosophy evaluation that is that come under the umbrella, or that come under one umbrella. But we can have a Made in Africa evaluation there. We can have a Maori evaluation. We can have the Pacific-led evaluation appearing as small trees, a metaphor of a forest where you have all these different cultural evaluation frameworks or evaluation that are informed by cultural paradigms. The third view is that there are cultural paradigms that share similar ontological and epistemological assumptions. For example, the Ubuntu paradigm, the Maori philosophy, the Hawaiian philosophy, and these, because they share same assumptions about the nature of reality, epistemology, and values, they can come under what we call an indigenous paradigm. So these cultural paradigms, they take different forms. I have called a cultural paradigm a post-colonial indigenous paradigm. But because they share the same ontological assumptions about the nature of reality, knowledge, and so on, they can come under what we call an indigenous paradigm, or what some people prefer to call a decolonizing paradigm. And so this paradigm, of course, it emphasizes, I'll speak more about context. It emphasizes context and needs. The emphasis on context and needs comes because if you look at the Western paradigms, you look at the post-positivist, they will emphasize method, that the most important thing in evaluation is precision. You look at the pragmatic, they will say, well, you can be precise, but there's no use if the findings are not put to use. So they have a use branch. And so you have the interpretive, who will emphasize on values, and you have the transformative, which will emphasize on social justice. So we are saying that the evaluation should have a branch that is called context and needs. So if you look at the current discussion on the evaluation tree metaphor, you'll find that it has, as I said, use, it has methods, it has use, it has social justice, it has values. Now we are saying that we can actually have a branch that is called context and needs, that defines what indigenous evaluation paradigm looks like. So what is context? Under current practice, when we talk of context, we are talking of interpersonal and individual characteristics, but scholars writing on cultural responsive evaluation have added the power dimension of context. relational power, which is power between the funders, for example, the donors and the recipients, and the country, the development partners and the countries, and political power, which is basically about geopolitical power, where, for example, those methods from that are Eurocentric are preferred over indigenous approaches. Discursive power, which basically talks about power that may be due to culture, like, for example, gender norms, class, and so on. And historical powers, of course, that goes back to the history of evaluation with its colonial attitude. And so we are saying that indigenous evaluation is about a holistic approach to context where issues of spirituality and vision are included, where issues of relationality, connectedness, interdependency, and identity are included, and of course, issues of power. So when we say needs, the branch is about context and needs. So when we say needs, what are you talking about? When you say need, the issue is that the current programs and development projects, they do not take into consideration the heterogeneous needs of the people. Usually you go and the government says, these are priorities, and the development partner comes with a project and it says we are aligning this to the needs of the country, and there goes, now there's a project to construct a road that connects two villages. And then what happens is there are some stories that for that child road, some of the villagers, they are just using it to dry maize. Why is that so? Whose needs were served? Is it possible to serve the multiple needs that people might have in a community with one project? What do we need to do then? Maybe think of multiple interventions that can address the heterogeneity of the needs. That's why we think that indigenous evaluation with a context and needs branch is very important. So these are the three views. Unfortunately, my other three, I don't know whether it shows here because, oh yeah, there it shows. Okay, so these are the three views. Yes, let's recognize an indigenous science paradigm. What does it look like? It has different cultural paradigms, but those cultural paradigms, they have something in common. And because of that, they come together to form an indigenous science paradigm. Another view, oh no, let's not talk about the paradigm. Let's have all these different cultural informed evaluation frameworks, let them appear like a forest, and bring also the Eurocentric evaluation paradigms and frameworks, and let's form a big forest. And of course, my point is, I am of the view that no, we have the four paradigms, bring in the fifth one, and that is the context and needs branch. So what is the point? The point is that we can all participate in the uptake of indigenous evaluation, and that currently there are promising practices. For example, New Zealand has promising practices that allows meaningful country-led evaluation practice. Though I don't like saying country-led. What is there? Shared history, the shared history of the indigenous people and meaningful relationships shape the engagement. There is cooperation underpinned by relationship, and there is focus on relationship-based commissioning. Priority is given to evaluators who incorporate cultural knowledge and have competency in indigenous evaluation. The other most important thing is that there is also an engagement in evaluation capacity building that focuses on indigenous evaluation methods. And another most important aspect of what takes place in New Zealand is that they are developing and piloting indigenous evaluation tools and methodologies in the commissioned evaluation projects. In South Africa, for example, the government is partnering, another good example, the government is partnering with the South African Monitoring Evaluation Association to advocate for the application of African evaluation guidelines in the monitoring and evaluation in the country, and encouraging every evaluator who comes in South Africa to apply those African evaluation guidelines. Of course, some development partners, they use reference groups to monitor the process of commissioning and making sure that, hoping that the reference group will engage will make sure that there's an engagement between the evaluation partners and the countries or the recipients, but there's always this thing that sometimes the reference groups don't pay much attention. But another important development is that the VOPs are developing networks that are developing protocols that promote indigenous evaluation. And Eval Indigenous is an example. And of course, evaluators are also developing indigenous evaluation methods and tools. And evaluators are also adapting Euro-Western models to try and contextualize them. And there's a lot of literature and there are lots of frameworks. For example, a framework by Mbava, an evaluator in South Africa, an adapted framework, which is an adaptation of the realist evaluation framework. So these are good things that shows that the revolution has taken root. There is already a revolution. And so, what are the areas IFAD might engage? Meaningful engagement with government in so-called country-led evaluation. And what does meaningful mean? It means ensuring that governments are actively involved in identifying and monitoring the process of right from the beginning of the identification of a project, a development project or intervention right to the end. And IFAD might also test and practice new and innovative indigenous evaluation approaches, techniques, and tools. And the big one, IFAD should engage with the decolonization of evaluation. Some development partners are already engaging with funders, and funders are willing and looking forward to transformative changes. So decolonization, the decolonization wave has taken root, and people have started to listen. The funders have started to listen. Development partners are starting to listen. And so it's time to engage. So IFAD can participate in funding the development of indigenous science evaluation. Talk about decolonization. I am in the, I'm in the board of the International Evaluation Academy, and I am responsible for the decolonization program. And I'm looking forward to working with development partners that may be wanting to trial test an innovative evaluation framework, partners who may be willing to actually develop, for example, a systems thinking approach to evaluation that is indigenous, that is using connectedness and relationality as concepts that inform how we can figure out a systems approach to program planning and evaluation that will, for example, maybe end up with a situation where we fund heterogeneous needs. So IFAD can engage, they can apply national and regional evaluation frameworks. For example, we have the Made in Africa evaluation. Why not make use of the Made in Africa evaluation if you are going to engage with the countries in Africa? The Maori evaluation framework, the Pacific-led evaluation framework, these are frameworks that are waiting to be used, to be tested, to be popularized, to take the same stand that the logic framework takes. And IFAD can consider a system-informed approach to identifying and designing projects, I've said that. And IFAD can try to adopt a more inclusive and holistic approach to context in the evaluation practice. That is appreciating and accepting that spirituality and interconnectedness is what is missing from the evaluation that we do. And that given the climate change, it is now evident that we need to connect with nature the way indigenous people has always done and the way indigenous evaluation is proposing, and that we can no longer treat nature as a commodity to be used, but we can treat nature as living, as dynamic, as breathing, as something that we need to appreciate. And if we do so, we'll not have trouble trying to now come up with laws that will guide how we interact with nature, because Indigenous evaluation has those laws. They've been there and they are still there. And the appeal to engage with Indigenous evaluation is so that you can learn some of the natural laws that Indigenous people have always had with nature, and how those laws can help evaluators when they engage with projects and with programming and with monitoring and with evaluation. Thank you. That brings that is the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Bagele. I think it's fascinating, and it's good also for us to reflect from time to time on the implicit and tacit assumptions of the paradigms we are adopting. And particularly, I appreciated the one of the elements is also looking at three key elements constituting elements of a paradigm, such as ontology, nature of reality, epistemology, the nature of knowledge of or what we can know, and axiology, sort of the worthiness or system of value, if you wish, which in a way permeate our approaches and systems of thinking, whether we recognize it or not. So we have about 10 minutes perhaps to continue the discussion. And what we could do is to hear from either other members of the panel and colleagues who are attending today, whether they have any question. Perhaps, Bagele, you could stop sharing so we can see all the participants on the screen. And we can see also the questions.
Okay.
I see there's already a question from Donna Mertens, who is also a member of Evaluation Advisory Panel. And we can start from her, and I'm sure other colleagues will also raise their hand.
Bagele, thank you so much for a really stimulating presentation and for bringing us up to speed on the revolution that's needed if evaluators are to be responsive when working in countries that have been colonized and working in ways that are responsive to the indigenous communities. You mentioned several frameworks, and you know, some of the issues that are bothersome to me, and I hope you might be able to comment on it, is the heterogeneity within the indigenous communities. In New Zealand, the Maori community is probably closest to one country that has a cohesive indigenous group. In Botswana, of course, you have many tribes, is true in many other countries. And of course, in Australia, is crazy, the number of individual tribes that there are, Aboriginal tribes. And so it also, that raises issues for me about how we can be inclusive and be sure that we have the right indigenous voices in the room, the strategies for doing that. Because also within some indigenous cultures, there are cultural beliefs that put women in a lower position, or that put people with disabilities in a lower position. And so I'm wondering if you can comment about those tensions when you want to be sure you have the right people there. There might be cultural barriers about being inclusive, and there also might be disagreement amongst the indigenous groups within a context.
Thank you very much. And perhaps we can take 2 or 3 questions together and then give back the floor to Bagele. And on this line, I would like to give the floor to our colleague, Monica Lomenia, for a question or a comment. Monica.
Yeah, it's indeed. Thank you, Fabrizio. Thanks for the presentation. I think it's inspiring from the sense of the values and the critique. I think we have to make to ourselves. But my first reaction, I mean, my PhD research was in Senegal, and I explore a little bit some of the aspects that you touch on. But I think it's very difficult to decolonize evaluation if we don't decolonize international development in general, because at the end we are just one part of the big picture, right? So how we can delink ourselves from the OECD criteria and so on, and but it's true that there are maybe like some parts where we could be more creative. My question to you is how you relate to the work. I remember there was this reference of the evaluation roots or the evaluation theory tree that Carden and Alkin put out there in 2012. It's been a while, and they were talking about indigenous evaluation methodologies and adapted and adopted methodologies. And I found very interesting because there was one that I explored in my thesis, that this is experience capitalization, sistematización de experiencias in Latin America, that they claim it was really indigenous. It did not emerge from the Western cultures, but it has been expanded all over the world and adapted differently in different places. So I wanted to know, like, how you relate to that, all that work, and if I wanted some clarity, if what you are proposing is something totally new that you want to delink to anything else has been done before, and it's more on this part of ontology, epistemology that Fabrizio mentioned, that's something totally new, or you think that there is some space for these adapted or adopted methodologies that could be useful also if they are well contextualized. Thank you.
Thank you, Monica. And we take another question. That's from another colleague in our office, Maciel Jimenez, please.
Hi, thank you so much for the presentation. It's very, very interesting to see a lot of theoretical research and background information on this particular topic, which is not that common, I will say. Even within development studies, it's somewhat new topic that is being explored and presented there as something tangible to work with. I just have one question and one comment mixed between the two of them. For the case of Latin America, like Monica said, there has been several experiences that we call sistematización de experiencias, which is sort of document in a way what has happened and why this resulted in such. And I think that one of the main challenges, and I'm speaking again for the Latin American region, is that when you have differences of concept of development, even within the own country. And as IFAD, you are working, of course, you're given a loan, you're given a grant, etc. You're working with the government. And then you find that projects themselves have different ways of developing the interventions. And then the benchmark or the indicators to which you're trying to see how the project really deliver, it's different from the perception of the government and also from even the targeted population. There has been some cases, for example, in Nicaragua, where you have different, let's say, approaches of health in indigenous areas, where the government has recognized those, but then you have a project that comes from X bank, and then they try to go with this, let's say, Western way of health interventions and education interventions as well. So then you have this challenge of, okay, so people who are benefited are saying that this is the way things should go, but then the project that you sign with the government has a different way of delivering things. So then here is where indigenous evaluation approaches come in and are very useful to sort of find a ground there to produce what the results are. And my question is, how do you, in practical terms, how do you do that when you have the government saying, no, we should do this health interventions like this, but then you have indigenous population that say otherwise, that they should do it in the other way, which is not the usual mechanisms used by the government to deliver health services, for example. I think this is something that a lot of Latin American countries struggle with when we call it cosmovision, which is cosmovision, or your vision of development is different from your own government. And then you have conflicts there. So I think if you could share any advice or insights on how to navigate this conflicts, and that would be great. Thanks.
Thank you. And then, so let's hear from Bagele, her reactions to these questions and comments.
Thank you. I'll start with the second question on the adopted, and predominantly indigenous. Okay. Yes, I'm very much aware of the tree, and of course that tree has been critiqued from the point of view that it does not include indigenous evaluation frameworks. But your question was, am I proposing that the indigenous evaluation paradigm is exclusive of adapted and adopted? My answer is that elsewhere I've talked about the adopted and the predominantly indigenous. So when I'm talking about an indigenous paradigm, I'm basically talking about evaluation that is predominantly indigenous, in the same way that you can talk about an evaluation that is predominantly quantitative. You can have some qualitative elements, but it is predominantly quantitative. So I am saying, we talk of, for example, cultural responsive evaluation. So cultural responsive evaluation, I think, is responsible for most of the adopted and adapted frameworks. That is, you are adopting and adapting, but you are still adopting and adapting in the context of a predominantly Euro-Western paradigm. So I'm saying, what I'm saying is that even cultural responsive evaluation has not gone far enough, because sometimes it is still constrained by the paradigm from within which it operates. That is why, for example, going to the second question of the conflict between the indigenous people and the governments, it is because evaluation is, as a discipline, is still operating in the context of a predominantly Eurocentric approach to evaluation with its colonial attitude. So what am I proposing? What can be done in the context of that conflict? If we think of evaluation and we think of our role in decolonizing evaluation, we'll begin to address, to see that conflict as a problem of power dynamic, as a problem of abuse of power that is accommodated in the evaluation discipline. So what needs to be done is, we need, as evaluators, to begin to see ways of negotiating power such that indigenous people, the indigenous communities, also have a say. I had an experience where somebody was describing how they are trying to bring in all voices to be heard, and how they've developed a monitoring evaluation instrument as an organization, which allows them to see, to make sure that there is a dialogue between all the stakeholders. And it's a question of how do you come up? You have to have a way of trying to address those power dynamics, because they are there. And the fact that you are you go into the evaluation field with an assumption that everything, people are equal and people are going to agree. The starting point is that you should problematize that and see that as a problem. And therefore, as an evaluator, begin to come up with the innovative ways of dialoguing the stakeholders. And then the other question was on the heterogeneity of indigenous people. I really thank you, Donna, for that question. But my point is that people in low and middle income countries, the formerly colonized, they are as heterogeneous as the West, the North is. And if the North has managed to deal with evaluation in a context where you have Russia, you have these people and that people and that people, and everywhere we have that heterogeneity. The indigenous heterogeneity is no different from that. And these are people that have, that emphasize connectedness. People are connected. And they have ways, just as democracy perhaps is said to have started somewhere in Europe or whatever it is, they also have democratic ways, indigenous democratic ways of working together and addressing issues together. I hope I've answered.
Thank you. Let me check if there's any other questions. And if not, we can give the floor to our director, Nindra Naidu, for his final take on.
Can I make a comment? Sorry,
Hans,
I didn't raise my hand.
sorry, Hans, before then, Hans, yes.
Just a quick thing. Thank you very much for this interesting presentation and quite different perspectives. I just wanted to add one perspective, perhaps, that while you're talking a lot Eurocentric, and I think we are maybe not as powerful as some would like to think in Brussels even, because there are a few other great powers out there in the world, including Russia, including the United States, and a lot of evaluation in Australia and all kinds of places. And in fact, I think it's maybe what you're referring to is that evaluation research is dominated, of course, and evaluation practice in some of these countries where there is actually more or less demand, a public demand for transparency and accountability. And this is something that has been driven evaluation. You don't see the same demand in Russia or in China. I was in China 3 times before the COVID, and they see very much now a need for evaluation, but it's in a perspective of check, control, and command. It's quite a different use of evaluation, actually, that in order to get public investments more effective. And just as a parenthesis, the largest colonial power today is Russia, who is dominating a lot of republics. And there could be a lot of indigenous evaluations in that country as well, but I don't think we see that very much of it. So it links to some other factors where evaluation is thriving and where it's going. So it's really great, you know, if Africa and other places, Latin America, are now developing their own approaches. And to start or finish on a positive note, I was very intrigued by your Ubuntu reference, and I understand that South Africa has actually now developed guidelines in the central government for including transformative equity into evaluation practice, not just as a concept, but actually instructing local governments and ministries, departments to use this together with the other criteria that they do have imported or they have developed themselves and they found useful. And a mix of this will lead to, you know, an indigenous or at least a homemade approach to evaluation, which will be very interesting to see how it's going to be rolled out. Thank you very much.
Good. Thank you very much, Bagele, for the excellent and stimulating input. Most certainly makes all of us think, but we're also thinking in terms of application. As a member of the Evaluation Advisory Panel, all of you are going to be in Rome in a few weeks' time, and let's continue the discussion, because we would like to get guidance on how to implement this in the various evaluations that we do. I'm not going to try to summarize the very rich input Fabrizio has adequately facilitated and summarized. And this is the last of this first series where all members of the EAP have made inputs. It's part of the co-creation of knowledge. Just yesterday, I was a speaker at the Czech Evaluation Society on the book Transformation, which has been co-edited by Yoa Utu and Gita Batra. And as you know, so several of us got chapters there. I've got an introductory chapter. But some of the concepts that came up, which resonate very well with today, is the word strongly by Yoa of downward accountability. We go in, we extract information from citizens and beneficiaries, but very seldom do we go and give the information back to them and tell them what happened. We just go to the governance boards, and that includes us here at IOE. And the second term that was quite useful is moving away from expert view to teams and to introduce methodological pluralism. I do not believe in the gold standard notion, because the methods need to fit the context. And the third part, I've been involved in AFRIA, as you know, Africa Evaluation, AFRIA Formation, SAMIA for a long time. I'm very pleased to note that finally we have a journal which is starting to document these experiences. And it's not that the work is not happening. I think the work is not published. And therefore, there's an assumption that the only evaluation taking place are from certain parts of the world. There's a lot more evaluation that takes place. And I think there's a lesson to be learned from the next series, the National Evaluation Capacity. Those were really governments, largely of the South, presenting their own experiences. In fact, IOE is going to be participating this year in Italy in next 7. But in the evolution of it, it shows that a lot more is happening out there than we give credit to. And it's a lot more driven from the country level than it used to be. So I think these shifts are taking place. But thank you from on behalf of IOE to the members of the panel, Bagele, always stimulating, all colleagues who have joined us on this Friday afternoon. And once again, we look forward to welcome you all in Rome so we can continue the conversation and appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.